I've had my ups and my downs.
I think it's an absolutely breakthrough experience.
Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, the show designed to inspire the pursuit of your physical best performance. I'm your host, Brad Beer. Listen in as we delve into how the world's top physical performers achieve their success, as well as the highs, the lows, and the journey of getting there. Let's get ready, set, let's go. Welcome to the Physical Performance Show, brought to you by our upcoming live stream event featuring prior Expert Edition alumni, Dr. Shona Halson. Recovery Essentials for Optimal Performance. I'm Brad Beer, sports physiotherapist and exercise scientist by trade and training, and founder of Pogo Physio. Each week, we'll bring you the latest and greatest information and inspiration designed to help you perform at your physical best. We do this across a range of different episodes: coaches' corners, interest editions, featured performers, and expert editions. And on this all-important expert edition, get ready with your pen and paper for many learn-ins from one of sports medicine's true greats, Dr. Margo Mountjoy. Now, listeners of this show are athletes of all levels, coaches, health and sports practitioners, and many will have heard the phrase RED-S, relative energy deficiency in sports. And as the name suggests, it's a state where an athlete finds themselves with a deficit of available energy. Now, the consequences of an athlete being in this state can include not only performance detriments, but also health side effects. In 2014, the International Olympic Committee, led by today's featured expert, Dr. Margo Mountjoy, published a consensus statement entitled Beyond the Female Athlete Triad, Relative Energy Deficiency in Sport. And this paper explored the syndrome of RED-S being impaired physiology caused by relative energy deficiency. Resultant impairments were stated to include effects on metabolic rate, menstrual function, bone health, immunity, protein synthesis, and cardiovascular health, with the key driving factor of this syndrome, relative energy deficiency in sport, being low energy availability. And during today's expert edition, Dr. Margo Mountjoy shares around the origins of coining the phrase relative energy deficiency in sport as she worked with her IOC medical committee counterparts. We explore the signs and symptoms of RED-S for athletes. Dr. Mountjoy outlines the incidence and prevalence of relative energy deficiency in sport amongst endurance athletes and athletes in general. And the prevalence has been reported to be up to 60% amongst athletes in endurance events. Dr. Mountjoy outlines how to screen for RED-S, the treatment of RED-S once it's been identified, how to lose weight and stay in energy balance, returning to sport post-pregnancy, and of course there's the issuing of this week's physical challenge as well. And before you get ready to impart the learnings, you'll hear Dr. Mountjoy mention the request for participation in one of Dr. Mountjoy's students' questionnaires around relative energy deficiency in sport, Megan Kookman. We'll have the link for this up in the show notes. It's key research, and I know the listeners of the Physical Performance Show can help out. So as a heads up, be sure to be jumping over the show notes and assisting Dr. Mountjoy, Megan, and the team with this all-important research. Currently, Dr. Mountjoy is the sports team physician for Athletics Canada and also Triathlon Canada, is an executive board member for FINA, whilst also fulfilling duties on several International Olympic Committee medical-related committees. So here we go with one of sports medicine's true greats, Dr. Margo Mountjoy. Dr. Margo Mountjoy, this is for me a real professional honour and privilege. Your work has been really something that I feel like I've clinically lived day in, day out for really the better part of 6 years, ever since you were the lead author on the International Olympic Committee's consensus statement on this term that we now hear more increasingly, and that is this term of RED-S, relative energy deficiency in sport. So welcome to the Physical Performance Show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's always a pleasure to chat with athletes and coaches and practitioners on this topic, knowledge translation from science to the field of play. is something that I'm very passionate about as a clinician scientist.
And I think that's where one of your contributions is so great. I mean, the tools you've helped output as a lead author and contributor really have, I believe, in my little vertical of sports physiotherapy, helped change my approach to this common challenge. So we want to go deep on this today. But Margot, to give the listener of the show who perhaps isn't in the practitioner space or the exercise science, sports sciences space or sports medicine space, a bit of context on your career. Reading your bio, I get tired. So how does Dr. Margo Mountjoy split her energies and intellect?
Well, I think like all of us in life, we are busy, and especially athletes and or clinicians are busy people. And I think it's just keeping, on a day-to-day basis, a balance between what your work is and what you do for fun and for fitness and family. So somehow, as a mother of three and a clinician, scientist, now a dean, it's just finding that balance and taking the time when you have it for yourself, for your own fitness, for your own fun and family. Well,
I've written down there: fun, fitness, family, clinician and scientist and dean. You sit on the board for FINA, the International Aquatics Federation, and also on several IOC medical-related committees, and your contribution in those spaces is very large. You're also the Canadian team physician for Synchro Canada. So I guess this was meant to be an Olympic year, 2020, as we record. What would have the year typically look like for you on an Olympic during an Olympic year, Margot?
Well, the Olympic year is, in the quad, it's probably one of the most exciting ones for me because of course, the Olympic Games. And right now I am supposed to be in Tokyo in the middle week between the two weeks of competition. Just to clarify, I no longer am the team physician for Artistic Swimming Canada. I am the team physician, one of the two team physicians for Athletics Canada, focusing mainly on endurance athletes. So certainly coordinates well with Reds. So the Olympic year for me would be a lot of preparation with the Tokyo Medical Committee, making sure that they have the games ready for our athletes. And when I say the games ready, I'm not talking about the venues. I'm not talking about the athletes' village. I'm talking about the health and medical care. So I'm responsible for working with a team of experts at the IOC to make sure that the polyclinic's ready, to make sure that the venue medical spaces are ready, but that the practitioners have the correct tools and skills to give the very best care to the very best athletes to A, prevent injury and illness, and B, treat injury and illness should they occur. And that includes public health issues as well. As a member of the governing board of FINA, then I'm also responsible for the delivery of the aquatic sports at the Olympic Games, so marathon swimming, diving, water polo, and artistic swimming. So it's a fun gig. Lots of interesting issues in Tokyo with the heat, with the water quality in the Odaiba Bay, where the marathon swim is supposed to be, as well as the triathlon occurs there, as well as the general challenges, of course, in the middle of a pandemic, which has postponed our Olympic Games for a year. So it's a great year on top of my regular job in Canada, which is I have a sports medicine clinic, the Health and Performance Center, as well as the Dean of the Medical School of McMaster in the Waterloo region.
Yeah, wow. So comprehensive and multifaceted, but I guess it's all the thread is the central theme of preventing injury and illness and treating injury and illness in athletes.
It is. Another component that I didn't mention is that I'm part of a task force. The IOC has designated the International Testing Agency as a task force to test athletes prior to the games from a doping perspective. So I'm working with that task force very hard in the year up to the games to test all athletes in all sports in a strategic, coordinated fashion to ensure that the athletes that come to the games are clean. So in that way, we're not only protecting the health of athletes by trying to prevent doping, but also ensure that the games are clean and fair for those athletes that stand up at the starting block during the event. So it's kind of really exciting to work with those experts around the world that are, leading in this field. I'm thrilled to be part of this group.
And then in amongst game cycles, you also are prolific with IOC consensus documents. And today we're talking about this concept of relative energy deficiency in sports. However, you've also contributed to documentation around guidelines around thermoregulation, altitude, sexual violence in elite sports. So you really are prolific, and you're far more than a one-trick pony, Margot, when it comes to academia, right, and clinical work.
Yes, well, the nice thing about working in association with the IOC as a volunteer is that in between the games, the medical commission is very active at trying to protect the health of the athlete, and this is a mandate from the President Bach down and before him as well, that the IOC has a duty and responsibility to sport in between games to protect the health of the athlete and the integrity of sport. And in doing so, the medical commission takes on topics and subjects that need, highlighting, that need advancement in the world of science. They support research on athletes as well as knowledge translation. So very, very excited to be able to, help change clinicians' output with respect to athlete health and protection.
And Margot, protecting the health of the athlete, perhaps in my day-to-day clinical work, in the very, I guess, niche world I live in, which is endurance sports, primarily triathletes and runners, perhaps one of the most underlying, under-recognised challenges I see is this concept of low energy availability and its sequelae in terms of health and performance detriments, health consequences and performance detriments. So in 2014, you as the lead author and your colleagues, you published a guideline, a consensus statement, I should say, Beyond the Female Athlete Triad, Relative Energy Deficiency in Sport, Red S. So can you paint a picture as to why that consensus statement was required to be published, and what was happening in the years prior that made this all of a sudden a topic on every sports medicine practitioner's lips from there onwards?
Well, absolutely delighted to talk to you about this. And then for me, it was one of my career highlights. We had been, we as a group of scientists, clinician scientists working in the area of endurance athletes as well as artistic judged sports, had published a statement, a consensus statement for the IOC in around 2003, 2004. It was my early days with the organization. And it was called the Female Athlete Triad Consensus Statement, and it was under the auspices of Arnie Lundquist and Barbara Drinkwater, who is not a clinician, she's a scientist from the United States. And so in 2013 actually was when we got together, 2014, we were tasked with updating that consensus statement because it was about 10 years old. And so the IOC wants to keep up-to-date statements on their website and also in the literature. So I was tasked to lead this group, and we convened a group of experts from around the world that were scientists and clinicians and mental health workers to look at the female athlete triad, which, as you may all know, is a syndrome of three components, one of which is low energy availability, and then another which is menstrual dysfunction, and then the third component is bone effects on bones, so thin bones. So we came to Lausanne to that meeting with our preparations of the various parts of the science that we were going to present and collate, with that task in mind, that we were going to update the Triad consensus statement. And we had drafted all our science and literature review, had done our preparations. And as we were presenting our various topics on day one, it became very apparent to many of us around the table that there were many other components of the body that were affected by low energy availability than just female menstrual cycle and bone. And in fact, that low energy availability is not a third component. It actually is the cause. of many different body systems that were affected in the health component. And there was also at that time some emerging literature that performance was also affected, but that male athletes were affected as well by the effects of low energy availability. And for several years, I'd been telling my male triathletes, at that point I was looking after the Triathlon Canada athletes, as well as the endurance athletes in running, that they had the female athlete triad. And you can imagine the look on their faces when they looked it up, and these men were being told they had the female athlete triad. So the evidence, we thought, had advanced enough to the point where we could coin a new phrase. And I mean, literally, it was on a napkin at a bar before dinner that we were coming up with this concept. And we really felt that the science had advanced enough that we could no longer do it justice to call it a female, because it was male and female. And we didn't like the word athlete because there are many artistic performers, dancers, Cirque du Soleil. There are many artistic performers that don't consider themselves athletes. And there are many recreational, physically active people who say, oh, I'm not an athlete, I just like to work out, that wouldn't perhaps register themselves as an athlete or recognize themselves, that wouldn't be represented in that term. And we for sure didn't think it was a triad because there was many more components of which, as I mentioned. So we decided to rename it so to better represent the science and to also better represent the groups of people that would be affected by it. So we came up with the term relative energy deficiency in sport, or REDS. And this term we think is certainly more representative of the science and more representative of the people that could be affected by it. It was a little controversial to do. The science is certainly far more advanced in the female athlete triad only component, but that science still contributes to REDS. And as well, what it has done is it highlighted male athletes and highlighted the other body systems and performance aspect, to then cause what I'm so delighted to see is an explosion of science since the 2000 publication in the field. And it's, on a monthly basis as journals publish their science, it's just so exciting to see the explosion of publications in this field. And we've learned so much in the interim time period in the area.
Yeah, so that gives a great background, Margot, the highlighting that it affects males, that it affects performers that don't always identify as athletes, themselves as athletes, the fitness enthusiasts that wouldn't necessarily term themselves an athlete. That makes sense. And the other body systems that are affected beyond the female athlete triad. Does that napkin still exist? I hope it's in a frame somewhere. It's changed sports medicine forever.
It actually does exist, and it was literally, we were having pre-dinner cocktails. The IOC does. We're volunteers always when we work with the IOC, but they do feed us when we come to Lausanne for the meetings, and we were having pre-dinner cocktails that napkin really was there as we were coining the phrase, and then totally switched the second day of our meeting when we were really trying to flesh it out a little bit better and then redraft our original writing. So it was really quite an exciting time to be part of the change in people's focus. It really isn't a change. Low energy availability was around. Low energy availability is what it is, but we're widening the scope and widening the application.
Okay, great. And let's talk about low energy availability. But I must ask, Margot, it only dawned on me perhaps in the last 48 hours in preparing for this conversation, the word relative. I think we rattle it off quite easily, relative energy deficiency in sports, REDS. But relative is relative to what? Is it relative, I interpret as intake and output, it changes, so it's relative to the time, the stresses of the athlete, the individual. What was the origins of the word relative being included?
I think that is a very key component, and we strategically put it there for the reason to make people think about that. And I think, the most obvious one that you've hit on already is that relative energy between intake So how much energy you eat per day and the timing of that, as well as the energy output or expenses that the body has. And so that's, relative to each other. If you sit on the couch and don't do anything, your intake is very different, and the difference between, the deficiency can be very different for an athlete who's very active versus the athlete or the non-athlete that's sitting on a couch. So that first very obvious one you've pointed out already. But we know that it's also, the term relative refers to much more than that, and it can be relative to the timing in the day that your energy expenses are to your energy intake. So it's not just at the end of the day, if you tally up, I spent X percent of kilocalories of energy in my exercise, and at the end of the day, I ate this much, so I'm good. It's actually more than that. It's relative to the energy expenditures throughout the day. So if you have trained, let's say as a triathlete, you've done your morning swim, you've gone for your bike ride in the morning, and you've done your afternoon run, and you haven't eaten anything all day, and at the end after you have a big dinner and you say, okay, I've made my balance up. That's not true. For most of the day, your body's been in a relative state of energy deficiency. So it's a little beyond just a tally at the end of the day. And we also use the term relative to connote different periods of time in the cycle of an athlete throughout a year. So periodization, if people are familiar with that word, and how that fits there. So it is a term that it can be many meanings, and we put it there strategically to allow people to think about energy beyond just a balance sheet of tally. It's more than a balance. We didn't call it relative energy balance or balancing your energy. We called it relative energy deficiency for a reason.
Thank you for sharing. Margot, low energy availability, I think we feel like we intuitively grasp what that means, but what would be your definition of it, Margot, and what does a listener of this show need to be aware of in terms of this low energy availability label?
Right. So low energy availability is a very important term to define, and thank you for asking that. It is the difference of what's left over between our energy expenditures minus our energy expenditures, and then there's a mathematical formula per kilocalorie of fat-free mass per day. So don't worry about the formula, but think of it as how much energy is available when we take away the difference between what we eat and what we spend. And we often think about the expenses of sport, which are, pretty high spenders in endurance and triathletes and in elite athletes as well. But there's other energy expenditures that we as human beings have on a daily basis, and that's our heart beating, breathing, digesting our food, our metabolism, our basic resting metabolic rate that's an energy expense. And there's also energy expenses that we have that a lot of people forget about, and that's walking to work, that's walking around work, going to school, going shopping, shooting some hoops with your kids just for fun. And we don't think of that as, sport or energy expenditure. That's just something we do for fun. Or going for a bike ride with your children around the neighborhood. Now, there's energy expenditures in a daily life that also add into that equation. So when you have low energy availability, what that means is that what you've spent in terms of energy output is greater than what you've taken in energy intake. So we could look at it as a tally through the day, which I've mentioned previously, but it's also throughout the day, what energy we have available to use throughout the day. So you can, just as a simple example, and we all know teenagers perhaps and other people that will go for the run and they haven't eaten their breakfast yet. So they're already running on empty. Their tank is empty. They haven't taken in any energy, and they're spending energy already off the bat without having any balance or they're already in a low energy state doing that kind of activity.
Yeah, so there's the obvious output through exercise, which, as you say, is a high expenditure task, if you like, or activity. But then there's all the basic functions of daily living that I feel, Margot, we tend to all probably underestimate just what's required in fueling those processes.
Yeah, and I think you're right. And I think the other thing we underestimate is energy intake, because we, as human beings, have probably most of our lives relied on appetite to trigger us to eat. And it's a very good thing, appetite, and in normal human beings, it's pretty good at telling us when we need to fuel up and that when we need to increase our energy for our expenditures. But we do know that appetite is not a very sensitive indicator in the very heavy spenders. So, for the endurance athletes, for triathletes, long distance runners, long distance swimmers, for those athletes that expend a lot of energy and are at the very elite level, they do need to be a little more strategic at actually measuring a little better their average energy outputs and making sure that their energy intakes are compatible to at least meet their demands. I mean, it's a little bit like a car. If you don't put gas in it, it's not going to run. And our bodies need fuel, and food is our only fuel. And so when we work with athletes, especially the heavy spenders, we want to make sure that they're eating the correct, not only amounts of energy, but that the foods they eat have the right micronutrients to protect them, as well as being energy dense. And that's a term I will define for you by energy dense, meaning, if you eat all day, lettuce and apples, you may get a fair volume and feel full, but those foods, while being extremely healthy and very good for you, are not energy dense, and putting things with them to improve the energy density. So if you're going to have a recovery food of an apple, we might say, well, why don't you have it with some cheese and peanut butter and some crackers with the apple slices, so that when you're having that snack, it's more energy dense.
And that feeds in beautifully, Margot, with the prior expert edition featuring fellow scientist and practitioner in terms of as a registered dietitian, Patrick Wilson, author of The Athlete's Gut, who mentioned on these high energy expenditure athletes that, you need to include those energy dense foods, otherwise you just can't consume the required amounts. That idea that appetite's not a good indicator, Margot, is fascinating. I feel like one of the things I say often to endurance athletes as we work through a bone stress injury recovery process or otherwise is, and it feels almost so simplistic, but is eat more than you think you need. So is that okay advice to the endurance athlete?
Yeah, it probably is, and I think
it's pretty simplistic.
It's really tough to eat when you're not hungry. Yeah. I mean, I get that. So I often say to them, you need to be kind of like to use a better term, like a bunny rabbit that seems to be kind of munching all the time, and that doesn't mean you eat all day long. But 3 meals a day isn't going to cut it as an endurance athlete. You need to have your, obviously a good breakfast. You need to have, though, build into your routine a mid-morning snack. So it's kind of like a recovery. Think of the recovery nutrition that you have as part of your training. As much as sleep is part of your training, and recovery days and rest days are an important part of your training, so is the recovery nutrition that you have after your training bouts. So then, a good lunch, and then you have a little more training. You have to have an afternoon snack, and then you have your evening meal, more training, and evening meal, and then you have a snack in the evening. So it's kind of like, instead of, your solid 3 square meals a day, you're having your 3 square meals, but you're also having those recovery, midday, mid-afternoon, evening snacks. And that helps sort of space out so your gut's not overextended, and as well helps periodize the food intake and energy around the day where your expenses may be.
Because the energy availability needs to be there throughout the day, not just caught up in one big lump sum at the end of the day.
Correct. That's a very important message. I hope that people are listening and hear today.
Yeah, this is fantastic, Margot. And Margot, just to recap, you said think of recovery nutrition as part of your training, and I think if anyone forgets anything, they won't forget be like a rabbit, snack all day.
Be like a rabbit. But we do know how important sleep is for preventing injury and for training adaptation. Nutrition is also an incredible important, and the timing of that and the composition of what that is also very important.
Before, Margot, we look at the incidence or prevalence of energy deficiency in sports, which I found very confronting when I dug into the literature. Can you just highlight how this low energy availability state can have the consequences of that on health and performance in the papers, the guide, the consensus statements, the clinical assessment tools? There's a hub and spoke, beautiful diagrams, which I think you see reproduced many times over anywhere you look now. But for those that haven't come across that, can you just, in words, best describe what those hub and spoke models look like?
Yes. So at the center in the hub is low energy availability, and that's the key cause of all of the health consequences. And one of those health consequences, so one of those spokes is menstrual dysfunction, obviously, in women, and another spoke is the effects on bone. So thinning of the bones and the microarchitecture. So that is the classic old triad. And then there are many other spokes of health systems that can be affected. The metabolism can be affected. Cardiovascular function can be affected. GI or gastrointestinal system can be affected. We can have mental health effects. Now, that's a very important spoke coming out from low energy availability that I'll spend just a moment on, because the low energy availability can cause some effects on mental health or psychological system, including, irritability. I don't know if you know anyone that's on a diet that might be kind of grumpy because they're in a low energy availability state. So, the irritability, the little bit of clouding of judgment or lack of focus that may happen. But that is the only spoke on this model that has an arrow in the other direction. So the psychological challenges or difficulties can actually cause the low energy availability state. So that would be eating disorders or disordered eating. Now, those illnesses, if we call it that, by the DSM-5 or the Diagnostic Statistic Manual, can affect the other side of the equation. So that's the energy intake component, not the expense part of it, but the intake. So if you voluntarily restrict the energy intake, either through having a fully diagnosed eating disorder or disordered eating behaviors, then by restricting that intake, you're not fueling the body. And so that can actually cause the low energy availability state. So just wanted to highlight that one in particular. So there's, all of the body systems are listed that are affected in the science that we know in the health component. Now, what we've also done is we've taken the same model and we've added, so the low energy availability is in the hub and spokes coming out. We've also adapted it for performance effects. So the science, although not quite as strong as on the health side, the science does support quite nicely in the interim time period that performance is also negatively affected by low energy availability. And I think this is something that as a clinician is intuitive to me, because often coaches will send their athletes to me saying, hey, this person's just not performing, fix them. What's wrong with them? When in fact, sometimes, there's many causes of poor performance, but when I dive down deep, sometimes that cause is actually low energy availability. And we do know that athletes that don't perform as well can have some performance consequences. So the spokes then of that model for performance can be decreased adaptation to the training stimulus. So if you go through a training program, you might not actually become faster or more efficient at your sport. The other, another spoke can be increased risk of injury, and we know that injury affects your performance. Another one could be a illness, and athletes can get an illness that will affect negatively their performance. And there are several others on that diagram.
You're listening to Dr Margo Mountjoy on this expert edition exploring relative energy deficiency in sport, Red S. Support for today's show comes from our upcoming live stream event, Recovery Essentials for Optimal Performance, with none other than prior featured expert, Associate Professor Shona Halson. Dr. Shona Halson has been touted as the world's leading expert on athlete recovery. Shona was the director of the Australian Olympic Committee's Recovery Centre at the 2008, 12 and 16 Olympic Games, whilst also heading up the Australian Institute of Sport's Recovery Centre for 15 years. Shona has published in excess of 100 scientific papers and has consulted to some of the planet's leading sports teams, organisations, brands and athletes. During this 3-hour live stream, Dr. Halson will cover 4 key modules: fundamentals of recovery, recovery periodization and adaptation, sleep science, optimization and essentials, and recovery science mythbusters. All participants of the live stream will receive a workbook, post-event recording, and access to the live Q&A. Tickets are available from just $49 by jumping over to pogophysio.com.au/Dr. Shona Halson live stream. For now, let's jump back with this week's featured expert, Dr. Margo Mountjoy, on the topic of energy availability for athletes and the identification and treatment of relative energy deficiency in sport. So, Margot, we've identified some of the consequences on both health and performance of a state of low energy availability. Such a pragmatic question, but how does it get measured?
Brad, you asked the tough questions. So wouldn't it be lovely if we could just do a simple little blood test and the answer is yay or nay, yes or no, you have low energy availability, and it's, wouldn't it be nice? I've spent many nights thinking about that. Like a pregnancy test, yes or no. There's no sort of area in between where it can be ambiguous. And the answer is it's not that simple. There's not a simple blood test that can be done that can like a mono test, say that will be yes it is or no it isn't. So it is not so easy to measure low energy availability. There are methods. There's methods where you calculate how much energy you expend by either using a pedometer for if you're a runner, or there are resources that say, exercising on a bike at this speed equals this many calories spent. So there's mathematical formulas that you can look up and do, but it's a little cumbersome. And then you have to measure the other side of the equation, which is your energy intake. And so that's, asking people to write down not only what they eat, but the quantity of what they eat. And so there's a recall bias, we call it, where people aren't very good, actually quite poor at estimating what they take, both from portion size, but also remembering the types of food. And yeah, I had salad, but they didn't say they put bacon on the salad as well as salad dressing and croutons and threw on some eggs as well. And so, people are very poor at calculating their energy intake. So in the daily life, it actually is a bit challenging, but it can be done. And if you work with a dietitian, you can, often measure your energy intake. You can do the calculations to measure your energy expenditures, put them in the formula that exists in the literature, and you can measure your actual low energy availability. But because it's rather cumbersome and perhaps, when people are doing their food diaries, they're being very good about what they eat, but then on a daily life, they're not maybe so careful, and it doesn't actually truly reflect true life. So we can do the formula. We do use the formula in research, but in real life, what we use is surrogates of the formula to detect low energy availability. So what I will do as a clinician working with athletes, we look at the hub and spoke. So I look at the spokes and I ask a history around all of these signs and symptoms. Are you having these signs and symptoms in a sort of a screening type of way with athletes? And that there is a screening tool that's been validated to actually detect low energy availability. It's called the LEAF Q. So LEA is low energy availability, F is females, and Q is questionnaire. So the LEAF Q helps us screen athletes in a way that's not as cumbersome as doing the food and energy calculations. There is a LEAM Q underway being developed. Now the M as opposed to the F is males as opposed to females. So that questionnaire, I'm anxiously awaiting validation. Not out yet, but stay tuned. So that is a way we can screen for low energy availability in an easier way than doing all the calculations. I also, in my athletes that I work with at the elite level, I will do blood tests, because when you look at the spokes, you can actually monitor some of these looking at hormones. You can do the resting metabolic rate to see if metabolism has changed. You can measure cholesterol to see if there's changes in cholesterol that will be affected in the cardiovascular system. So there's a number of things you can do in the lab to measure things. And not all women without their periods have low energy availability. There are other causes of amenorrhea or lack of menstruation that need to be investigated. Pregnancy is one in young women, as well as something called polycystic ovary. There's a number of other things that you must rule out before you say that you have REDS. I hope that's helpful.
That's very helpful, and I think it gives the insight that there's screening that's required. It requires an astute practitioner to be aware of it in the first place. And then really, and I recall one of your colleagues, Canadian colleagues, Trent Stellingworth, prior sharing that it's really a diagnosis of exclusion. Once you've ruled out the other causes of menstrual dysfunction for a female athlete and the other signs are there, then really that's when you would make the diagnosis of a state of low energy availability or RED-S.
Absolutely, and Trent is a guru in this area. So I think if I could just emphasize a key point for your listeners,
please,
that having amenorrhea in female athletes is not a normal part of training. It is not a desired state. For many years, coaches used to say, well, you're not training hard enough, you still have your periods. That is wrong. It is wrong, and female athletes should continue to have regular menstrual cycles. And if they do not, then it's a problem.
And I think that point just can't be overstated. And I consulted a 23-year-old triathlete several days ago who had not had her cycle for 6 years and has had a sequelae of bone stress injuries. And really, this is the first time the concept of a state of low energy availability has been brought to her attention, and it just startles and saddens me. I'm a father of young girls, and I'm glad that the tide is shifting, but there's still a long way to go.
Yes, there is. And I think having that, clinician awareness, but also coach awareness and athlete awareness. And I think, clinicians in medicine needs to catch up with the science, and I think it is.
Yes.
Certainly in my medical school, in the school that I'm the dean, you can be sure that in their subunit, when they're studying endocrine function and hormone function, that they're no longer studying the Triad. They are studying REDS.
Yes.
But it is very important that clinicians are up to speed and have a healthy index of suspicion. If you see a female endurance athlete or an artistic athlete with a bone stress injury or that, and you haven't looked at their hormones and asked them about their menstrual cycle, you're not doing your job. But I think I'd like to take it one step further, that if you're working with athletes that are in the higher risk range, you shouldn't be waiting for them to come in with a bone stress injury. You should be screening and preventing it from happening, because a bone stress injury is a significant injury in an athlete's trajectory. It's a good, if you're lucky, only 6 weeks for recovery. Certain bone stress injuries in other parts of the body take a lot longer to recover. And that's a big chunk of your season and training cycle that's affected. But athletes can also drive this. If athletes and coaches now understand the importance of monitoring health as an indicator of the ability to perform, and that when things start to go awry, step in early. It saddens me to hear that your athlete has been amenorrheic for 6 years. That's really hard to change. It's really hard to fix. If it's been 2 or 3 months, it's a lot easier to reverse. The body is much easier to reverse after 2 or 3 months of a problem than 6 years.
And Margot, in terms of the prevalence of this, I've read some findings that 60% of elite middle distance and long distance athletes and 23% of shorter distance athletes were in a state of low energy availability. Track and field athletes, 18 to 58% was the range on one reported paper, with the highest prevalence amongst the endurance athletes. So could you just add a little commentary as to how big of issue this is in sports?
Yeah, well, we're learning more and more every day, and I think it's pretty exciting. We have some challenges that people are measuring it differently from study to study, so we're really trying to find a nice way that we can standardize the measurements so that we can compare apples with oranges in these studies and come up with large systematic reviews where we can put together data from different studies and get a better picture. But you have mentioned some of the prevalence data already. Thank you for that. The long distance and endurance athletes, male and female, as well as artistic athletes are affected or have components of REDS. And what is exciting for me, and one of the studies that I did was on sprinters. And I expected, and our hypothesis was that we would not see REDS in sprinters. And because they don't have the long distance endurance, they're very short spurts. They're very well trained and fit athletes, but it's very different training. And in fact, my hypothesis was wrong, and that we did have prevalence, albeit lower, in the sprint athletes. And one study I'm working on right now, which I'm really excited about, is on male volleyball players, looking at low energy availability in them. Now, it's not published yet. I obviously can't tell you any of the results, and we're still data collecting, so I don't have the results. But we're actually seeing some of our preliminary results, looking at an elite men's volleyball team. That they also have some signs of low energy availability. So the prevalence, we need more data to give exact figures, but certainly the ones that do exist are very clearly a significant problem in the number ranges that you have already stated in the endurance athletes and the artistic athletes. Also weight-dependent athletes, so the ultralight rowers and jockeys. These are athletes that have to restrict their energy to meet a certain light weight so that they can perform at their best. So ski jumpers, those sports where weight is a dependent factor in performance as well. So they're not endurance athletes. Ski jumpers couldn't run, I don't think, 5 kilometers, but they are certainly light enough so that they can jump further. Same with jockeys. They're just light, usually male athletes. So there's those kind of athletes, because that's the other end of the equation, the energy intake, where there's restriction to meet a light weight. So very high prevalence in the jockeys, lightweight rowers, ski jumpers as well.
And then I've read data, Margot, that restricting energy intake or caloric intake can start very young. There was one paper that really confronted me. It said while less than 2% of the 748 runners surveyed reported disordered eating, over 23% of girls and 8% of boys reported dieting or skipping meals to lose weight. That was the work of Adam Tenford and colleagues in 2011. That was really challenging to read.
That is really tough to read for me as a clinician, trying to maintain people's health, especially in athletes who shouldn't really need to be dieting. I mean, they should be eating well and healthy to fuel their sports, but also as a parent to hear that that the numbers were so high. We do know that in the general population, dieting is pretty high, and I think that's driven by media, people trying to sell diets, people trying to sell gym memberships, and with diet and nutrition components attached to it. It's also driven by the fact that in our societies around the world, obesity and death from obesity is very high. In fact, there is certainly for good reasons, that there is encouraging people to eat healthy diets, and for some people to actually take diets to lose significant weight because their obesity is a health risk and their lack of energy expenditure. So if we look at the global health of society, the opposite end of the spectrum of what we're talking about today is a concern. So there is emphasis in society about healthy living and dieting and people that are obese. So in fact, some people may take that on too much. And our athletes, we're talking about the other end of the spectrum where we're not eating enough and fueling our energy expenditures enough, and the health consequences at the other end of the spectrum. So, and I think also We can blame a little bit of media and society on the emphasis on thinness in our movie stars, in our icons that are in society of what we think the ideal body should look like, when in fact most bodies aren't really made to look like that. And we also maybe impose it a little bit in sport, because we look at, say, the let's look at, say, an 800-meter runner or a 1,500-meter runner, which is, middle distance, and we look at what they look like, and they're very lean. These women and men are extremely lean. If we watch them at the Olympic Games or World Championships, and say a 15, 16-year-old runner in an 800 race would look at the Olympic Games of a 30-year-old woman, say, who's running that race, and they see what her body composition looks like, and will say, you know what, I need to look like that to run like her. And in fact, if you look at that same 800-meter runner or 1,500-meter runner, when they're training block, they don't look like they do at the Olympic Games. They lean down for the Olympic Games for that performance advantage that happens when they lean down. And it's done, if it's done properly, is done over a period of time with very calculated measurements and very calculated slow, slight energy deficits to bring them to that lean period in a safe way that doesn't affect their health, so that they can maximize their performance. They don't look like that during their training season and their off season. So these young people will watch them on TV and say, I need to look like that now to perform like them. And in fact, they run into difficulties, and they may diet on their own. They may diet and train more without proper coaching and proper nutritional input, and that's when they will run into trouble. And I see them coming into the collegiate system in Canada at the age of 17 and 18, where they've had 2 or 3 bone stress injuries, they've never had a period, and they're not performing. And that's really sad. It takes me a few years to unravel that, the mental space they're in, but as well as the focus on health and health for their performance, and to change that mentality.
I think that's such a key point. I mean, when we watch the Olympic Games or an elite level sporting competition, we are seeing those athletes optimize with their body composition for that performance. And I recall a practical example, Margot, as a junior triathlete, seeing the triathletes that I admired and aspired to be like, with their ribs visible on top of, but when back in the days of triathlon singlets, this below the chest, and thinking, right, you've got to be that lean to be that competitive, and thinking that's what I need to look like.
Exactly.
And, I just inferred that I needed to train more. I needed to be fitter. So that's a very practical example.
So you train more, which is it's not always the best way. Yeah. And I had Barbara Drinkwater, actually the female scientist who coined the female athlete Triad. She used to call those lean people pneumopods, basically 2 sets of lungs and a heart on stick legs. But that lean look, there is a desired body composition at the very elite level for optimum performance. There's no question. And anybody who denies that is denying the science that shows that it's true.
Yes.
It's how do we do that in a healthy way that doesn't negatively impact health while maximizing performance? And that is not something that a 15-year-old or a young youth athlete should be achieving. That's really restricted for the very elite of the elite. And those folks have sports scientists, sport physiologists, sports medicine, sport nutrition working with them. I don't know if anybody saw Michael Phelps's diet after Beijing. That was that big spread in the newspaper of what he actually eats on a given day. There's not a ripple of fat on that man's body. He's in a bathing suit, you can see. And yet the volumes he ate were incredible, but it was very calculated to match his energy output to maximize his performance.
Yeah, so there's so much there. And I feel, Margot, just back on the male athlete, we mentioned the female cycle, and you said if you're not asking questions around that, etc., you're probably not doing your job. And I feel the same is with, it can be an awkward subject, but it doesn't need to be. It's such key information around males' sexual function in terms of erections. And I've heard you speak about this. Can you share a little bit about that and what male athletes may need to be aware of in that department?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is very important. And it is something that needs to be talked about. And as much as we need to talk about periods in women, and I'm trying to normalize for women that it's okay to talk about their menstrual cycles. We need to know about it. Clinicians need to ask about it. And in fact, in the teams I worked with, it's actually one of our performance parameters that coaches will monitor, and that needs to be done in a sensitive way, of course, based on the women's comfort and the coach's comfort as well. But that is something that we're trying to normalize. But we also need to normalize it in male athletes as well. And certainly, I'm often known as the Woody doctor because I'm the one that will ask the guys. So when you wake up in the morning, do you have a morning erection? Because that's a very normal function of a male, and it shows healthy testosterone levels. It's a surrogate of that. But as well, what's your sex drive like and sex function like? And I have one male athlete who I hold near and dear to my heart that I've worked with for many years to reverse his REDs and to help him to become healthy and performing. And after about a year of intervention and working with him and monitoring his blood, he came into me for his blood results one day, and he sat down. He said, Doc, I had my blood work done last week. And I said, yes, I've got the results here. Shall we go over them? And he said, you don't have to tell me my results. He said, I know my testosterone's good. And I smiled at him and I said, really? And he said, I just realized that I'm in a class and in a lab. I just came from the lab. And did you know that today was the first day I realized that out of a class of 20 in my lab, I'm the only guy. And man, some of these women are hot. And so I thought, okay, I'm just letting you know your testosterone levels are great. And he goes, I know. So, having that awareness of a guy, what is my sex drive like? What is my sexual function like? What is, am I having those morning erections? Those things are very healthy and normal. And those are indicators to a man that their testosterone levels are probably okay. I mean, we probably should measure them, but they're probably okay if they're having those things, like a woman having a period. They're probably okay if they're having regular menstrual cycles. It may not be, a guarantee, because there's other things on that hub and spoke beyond menstrual cycle. Yes. But those are often the very most sensitive ones to low energy availability, and they're often, in many people, the first ones to be affected. Now, just as a caveat, in the mature woman that maybe has had children already, they may not lose their menstrual function, but have other signs and symptoms, because the more mature the menstrual system, the more resilient it is to low energy availability. So a younger athlete will have the amenorrhea more often than an older, more mature athlete.
Oh, so it's interesting. So the more mature female athlete, the change in cycle may not be as sensitive as the younger female athlete.
Correct. We also, and males don't know, so in women's, we can calculate 35 kilocalories per fat-free mass per day. It seems to be where it's healthy, and below that there's problems. We don't know that, we don't know, excuse me, what the number is in men.
And is that, what's the reason for...
45 kilocalories. I'm sorry, misspoke there. 45 kilocalories.
For women?
Per fat for women. We don't know exactly what that is in men, and we know that it might be different in different people. So, there's more science to be had. So if there's any burgeoning scientists out there that want to look in the field, Adam Tenford has done a lot of good work in the area in men. But there's other clinicians, Anthony Hackney, that's also doing some good work in low energy availability in men. There's good work being done, but we have certainly gaps in our science. And if there's any scientists out there, there's lots of work to be done.
If you missed last week's episode of the Physical Performance Show, it was an expert edition featuring author of The Athlete's Gut, the inside science of digestion, nutrition and stomach distress, Assistant Professor Patrick Wilson. There's been so much great feedback about Patrick Wilson's expert edition. It's one of those expert editions you're likely to need to go back to and listen through several times with a pen and paper. For now, let's jump back with this week's expert edition featuring Dr Margo Mountjoy exploring RED-S, relative energy deficiency in sport. Margo, I feel like low energy availability can be perhaps like the silent underminer, and in many ways almost tragic in its, invisibility, in that unless, someone picks it up, practitioners, the athlete coaches, it can go on for a long period of time, and yet the hours, the focus, the dedication to training and, trying to aspire to someone's physical best, is a large output, yet this can just sit there, quite silent, quite invisible, undermining health and performance. It's why these conversations, I guess, around menstruation and Dr. Margo, the Woody doctor, there's no room for it to be awkward, is there?
No, there isn't. And in fact, both the health and performance implications are significant. We spend so much time, fine-tuning the training and the type of shoes you wear and on all of that kind of stuff, but not paying attention to this other very important piece just doesn't make sense. And for that, I thank you for this podcast today, because part of the answer is getting the message out, raising awareness in athletes, raising awareness in coaches, raising awareness in clinicians of the importance, if we're really wanting to maintain an athlete's health and have them perform at their best and optimum, we need to look at all of those parameters beyond the obvious ones that historically we focused on, and we need to be thinking about some of these other things as well.
Margo, you mentioned your near and dear athlete whose testosterone levels improved, and that used the phrase reversing red S or reversing reds or low energy availability state. So there is hope and there is success that can be had. In sort of simple practical terms, what are the key ingredients to reversing a state of low energy availability in an athlete?
Yes, I'd like to leave your listeners with the key message that there's actually this can be treated, this can be managed, and we can bring an athlete back into optimal health and performance. And this is if we look at what the cause is, what we need to do is focus on addressing the cause. And if you look at the formula, it's energy intake minus energy expenditures. So the main focus I have is affecting that energy. So it may be that we need to increase the energy intake, and this is done on a stepwise fashion to change habits, because people's habits of eating are something they've done for a long period of time, and it's not easy to change. The types of food they eat, the timing of food they eat, the quantity of what they eat. So taking really that formula and addressing and maximizing the energy intake to have the correct macro, micronutrients and the quantities. But also we may need to address the energy expenses of an athlete. So those energy expenses, we may need to improve their training so that they don't overtrain. Some athletes will say, yes, my coach gave me a training program and it was great, and then I went home and ran 5 kilometers because I thought if I only did more, I could be better. And so stopping those energy expenditures that don't make sense. So we can sometimes slow up that energy expense side of the equation. And in some athletes that are severely ill, we need to stop them. It's very rare that I stop someone from exercising, but we may need to stop it or significantly decrease it. I must say a pandemic has helped, because people haven't been able to be very active. So some of my athletes now are starting to menstruate because they've had less energy expenses. But that's, of course, not something we use in a treatment. And in some people that have prolonged amenorrhea with bone effects, there are things we can maybe do to help protect their bones as well. And those are things getting into sort of the medical side. But from the simplistic side, we're looking at the equation and altering the energy intake, and then perhaps altering the energy expenditures. And then the final caveat there is that I like to let athletes know that this isn't a quick fix. This isn't something that, if you eat well for a week, you get your period back. It takes time and patience and consistency. And for menstruation in women to resume and for sexual function in men to resume, it may take several months. I often, don't even ask for 6 months. It can take that long. And the longer you've had amenorrhea, the longer it's going to take to come back. And to actually make an effect on bone architecture can take up to years, and in some older athletes, it may never resume to normal, but in the younger athlete, it has a greater chance of resuming to normal. So it's a long-term fix, not a short-term fix, and that's hard for people to wrap their minds around, but being patient and encouraging that you're doing the great thing, and in fact, focusing on how you're feeling and how you're performing in training, because those things are short-term things that you can notice a difference in, as opposed to using only menstruation and or bone microarchitecture as measurements of success.
So a couple of key takeaways there are focus on the effect in the energy, either the intake or the expenditure, so restricting activity perhaps, obviously increasing intake, being appreciative of the fact that time, patience and consistency are required, and then using simple monitoring tools which give you more, I guess, short-term feedback, almost instant feedback of how you're feeling with your training and your performance, Margot.
Yes, exactly.
Margot, the risk assessment model, just briefly, which yourself and colleagues outputted, the green, the yellow, the red. I guess it's a tool for practitioners, coaches, and the like, but also an athlete that can be, or an individual can be bought into. Can you just highlight a little how those categorizations can help with a bit of a framework around this for different individuals?
Yes, it is a clinician's tool, and what we do is you measure and look at different parameters of the hub and spoke, and then we can risk stratify an athlete into either red zone, yellow zone, or green zone. The green zone is a perfectly healthy, functioning athlete who we just encourage to carry on and enjoy their sport, and they're doing really well. That's really the ideal. Most of the athletes I look after will be categorized by this tool into the yellow zone, where we call that a caution zone, where they can continue to train, but we need to monitor and intervene and try and help them with some of their low energy availability outcomes. And then the red area, if an athlete is categorized by measuring their parameters that land in the red area, this is an area where they're most severe. Their health is significantly affected. They're really not allowed to train because of health risks. So it actually gives a clinician a guide to know, when do I stop an athlete from training and focus purely on their health because they're at high risk, or when can I just monitor them? So that would be the athlete in the yellow area, where I could monitor them, intervene, contract with them to improve things, and then hopefully on a graduated way, move them from the red into the yellow. And then obviously the ultimate goal is to move everyone from the yellow into the green area, where they're healthy, functioning athletes. Yeah,
and it's a framework that really does just give some direction and take some of the potential complexity out of it. Margot, final few thoughts here. Post-pregnancy or postpartum, anything you'd add to the exercise enthusiast or the athlete out there in terms of your medical knowledge on that time and fueling for the work required, not just for a return to sports activity, but also, bub, who's reliant on mum for fuel?
In fact, we don't have a lot of science on postpartum, but we do have anecdotal evidence and certainly case reports. And we do know that postpartum is a significant time of energy expenditures, because if a woman is breastfeeding, that baby's soul growth, and we know how much they grow in that first time period, is dependent on what the mother eats, and also the balance between what she spends. So if we have an elite athlete, especially an endurance athlete, who wishes to get back to top competitive form, is expending a lot of energy, and that baby is actually taking a lot of energy, plus the energy it takes to bring the body back into normal state and function. That costs energy as well. So the energy expenses in postpartum period are really high, and the energy intake needs to match that. And that's often where I've seen women run into bone stress injuries, is right first postpartum, and that's really preventable and shame, but it can happen. And we do need to learn more about that for those scientists that are listening. This is an area we need to have more information on.
Yeah, and I ask because clinically in the last few months, I've seen two mums returning to running postpartum who have both developed bone stress injuries. One's an elite runner and the other's a competitive recreational runner. And it can only sort of point towards, I guess, a fuel deficit with that huge energy expenditure in my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a really interesting time physiologically if you look at the postpartum period. And if I could just one caveat to say to people, please take care. Don't come back too fast. Take the time. with your baby. It's only once in a lifetime with that child, and don't rush it back, or you're going to be in trouble.
Okay, and wise words. And Margot, losing weight, can it be done healthily? If someone does need to lose weight, the question is, well, does that then have a consequence if there's too much weight loss on the health? So it's an area that often comes up. Okay, we need to keep energy balanced, but how do we lose weight if we do need to? We're not talking about sports performance, but post-COVID comfort eating, etc.
Right, absolutely. This is very healthy. Healthy ways to lose weight. I mean, there's the good, the bad, and the ugly ways to lose weight, and I'd like ways, and there are, and it's making sure that if you do need to lose weight, that you're eating a healthy, balanced diet throughout the day, avoiding the snack food, shall we say, chips, cakes, cookies, those kinds of things. If you're hungry for something, have a nice piece of fruit. Taking the salad dressing off and just enjoying a lovely salad without salad dressing, those kinds of things. So just being sensible about the energy intake, doing it slow, 1 pound per week, and increasing your energy expenditures instead of going spending the day on the couch because you're in lockdown. If you're going to be in the house, if you have a treadmill or a stand-up bike, spending some time on that. And if you're able to get out, go for walks. It's pretty safe in nature. If you can get to where you can walk or run or bike in nature, where you're not in large groups of people or at a gym, increasing your energy expenditures through exercise is certainly a good way. So it can be done healthy in a slow way. That the quick, rapid weight loss techniques tend to be, first of all, not successful. There's rebound, and second of all, there's health consequences.
Thank you. Well said. And Dr. Margo Mountjoy, every guest of the show issues listeners with a physical challenge for the week. So what is Dr. Margo Mountjoy's physical challenge going to be?
Oh, the physical challenge. Well, I guess for all the people in COVID-19 that are on lockdown, I physically challenge them to be more active. If it's the elite athletes, I challenge them to be smartly active. How's that? Make sure that you're paying attention to your body and that your energy expenditures are not at the detriment to your health.
Be more active, or for the elite athletes, be more smartly active. And finally, Dr. Margo Mountjoy, one piece of advice to help listeners of this show perform at their physical best. What is it going to be?
I think the one piece of advice would be to listen to your body.
Listen to your body.
Listen to your body. Pay attention. Is it hunger? Is there pain anywhere? Do I need to rest? Do I need a break? Listen to your body. It's usually pretty good. I think as elite athletes, we're pretty good at not listening to our body, ignoring the pain, ignoring this and ignoring that. Listen to your body, pay attention to it, and see if there's things you need to pay attention to.
Beautiful. Margo Mountjoy, Dr. Margo Mountjoy, we can find you on Twitter at Margo Mountjoy. Is there anything you wish to highlight? Obviously, I would encourage anyone listening today to please jump over and complete the Red S screening questionnaire, I should say, survey with yourself, Margot, and your colleagues, Meg Kookman, etc. But is there anything you wish to highlight in terms of beyond the survey or questionnaire?
No, I don't think so. I just really do encourage everyone to answer the questionnaire. We're wanting to find out more about athletes' experience and health and performance consequences. So Megan's, Quickman's survey is very important, and the information will help us help you as athletes be healthier and perform better. Yeah,
so we'll tag that up in the show notes and on social. And Dr. Margo Mountjoy, thank you for your contribution to the Physical Performance Show, and as a practitioner, thank you for your contribution to certainly the space that I operate in, day out.
Well, thank you, Brad, for not only your daily work with athletes, but for your key role in helping knowledge translation to reach people with this important messaging.
So there you have it, another expert edition of the Physical Performance Show, of which we hope assists you with your learnings and your pursuit of your physical best. As usual, I trust and I know you took a lot from Dr. Margo Mountjoy's share-ins. You'll find Dr. Mountjoy available over on Twitter at Margo Mountjoy, and be sure to jump over to Pogo Physio's show notes for this episode 232, and take part in Dr. Mountjoy and her research student Megan Kookman's all-important survey on relative energy deficiency in sport. They're needing 1,000 responses, and I know the Physical Performance Show listenership can assist with this all-important research. Please keep the podsies coming. They're always a lot of fun. That's simply a screenshot of the episode you're enjoying at any given time and tagging in the Physical Performance Show at Physical Performance Show. My social media handles at Brad_Beer. You'll find the show on Instagram and Facebook at Physical Performance Show. And don't forget to please hit subscribe if you are enjoying the highs, lows, and learnings. The episodes go live each and every Thursday evening Australia time, and subscribing really helps the show grow. Thanks again to all those who are leaving ratings and reviews over on iTunes. We read and enjoy them all, so please keep the ratings and reviews coming. Massive thanks, as always, to the great folk who make this show possible each week. Daryl Misson, our audio engineer, Matthew Walding, all things show graphic design, Susan Wilkin on all things show administration, and Lily Burden, social media behind the scenes. Don't forget to check out our very exciting upcoming live stream event with arguably the planet's brightest mind on all things athlete recovery, Dr. Shona Halson. Our prior live stream featuring Dr. Stephen Seiler was so widely enjoyed worldwide, so we're excited to repeat for October 24th's upcoming live stream with Dr. Shona Halson. Recovery Essentials for Optimal Performance. Jump over to pogophysio.com.au/Dr. Shona Halson live stream. Now, coming up on next week's episode of the Physical Performance Show, we're keeping the learnings going. We heard from you in last year's annual survey that the expert editions were loved by so many listeners. And next week, get set to enjoy the learnings from Rian Doris on an episode devoted to the intriguing and alluring state of flow. Rian Doris is the co-founder at the Flow Research Collective, co-founded with New York Times best-selling author Stephen Kotler, author of The Rise of Superman. Now, you'll have heard featured performers be asked to explain what it's like to be in the zone. So find out next week, scientifically, what the zone truly is, what conditions can help us find our way into the zone or flow, and so much more. Until then, keep pursuing your physical best performance. I'm Brad Beer, and this has been the Physical Performance Show.